One of the things I enjoy the most about my garden is that there's so many flowers in it that self-sow. That simply means that if I plant it one year, it'll go to seed in the garden, and the following year all sorts of little volunteers will come up. For instance, this Shirley poppy, I didn't plant it this year, it just came from last year's plant that went to seed. When I find that something like this has happened, I evaluate the seedling and I decide whether it's in a good spot or not. If it's not, I weed it out. If it is, I leave it. These Shirley poppies look fine here growing around these campanulas, so I've left them be. The same with these little Johnny jump-ups, which are jumping up all over the garden. They're just darling right here along the edge, so whenever they've taken an edge position, I've left them. The trick is to recognize what's a weed and what isn't when they first come up. This is a Johnny jump up, which is going to bloom just like that. This is a lamb's quarter, which looks very similar, but it's a weed, so out it goes. These little guys here are some alyssum, which are going to have lovely white flowers, and they've self-sown from last year, so I'll leave those too. If a taller plant self-sows, I have to make sure it's in a spot where it's not going to hide something else. Here, I'll show you an example. There are a lot of tall plants that self-sow in the garden. Cleome, Nicotiana, my tall pink perennial mallows will self-sow. And these bachelor's buttons, here they are. I can tell they're from last year because they're pink, and this year I only planted blue ones. But they're fine. They self-sowed right behind these white Shasta daisies, but they don't hide them. And they form kind of a nice backdrop here for the garden. Next year they may self-sow in the front, where they're not needed at all, so I'll just weed them out. A very tidy kind of gardener might not like to operate this way, but I think it's fun to work with nature and kind of look forward to her little surprises, and then just cull the ones that really don't fit in with my gardener's scheme of things.
All gardeners look forward to the time of year when they can plant seeds. It certainly is my favorite time, and I like to plant them in a fertile soil. And I know this soil is good and fertile because we have put in the compost, the rock powders, all the food that seed will need to take it from sowing right through to harvest. That's the sort of soil that'll make it grow best. Now, I'm prejudiced like any other gardener. I love these 30-inch wide beds I grow in, 1-foot walkway in between. But they're 30 inches wide for a reason. Besides being easy to step over, they're the right width for different rows of different crops. For example, 4 rows of something that doesn't take much space, like radishes. 3 rows of a crop like carrots fit nicely in the 30 inches. 2 rows of parsnips, beets, ones that need a little more space, and a single row of peas, corn, right down the center. Good space, plenty of rows to walk in between. That's the way I like to do it. Now, my planting tools are really pretty basic. A couple of sticks and a hoe. And if I'm putting in short rows, say I want just a few radishes every week, maybe I'll just put a row in right across the bed like this. A pointed stick like this does it easily. And I'll just take my packet of radish, open it and crease it. Makes a pretty simple planting machine. And I'm going to take a little extra time putting those seeds in. I'm going to tap them out carefully so they go in there at about 1 inch apart. Now that happens to be the distance at which they grow best. And so not only do I not have to think about coming along and thinning them, but they're going to get up to eating size just as quickly as possible with no problems. Now for another seed, I use a really complicated tool, a bigger stick. And this way I can make nice rows right on down the garden. And say I want to put a number of close rows, just like 3 rows of spinach in this bed. Easy to put in. They don't have to be too deep. If I want them a little deeper, I just run it like that. Sprinkle my seeds in, push the soil carefully over, pat the seeds in. For larger seeds and special situations, I use a hoe like this. This is an old design called a Cavex hoe. It has a curved bottom. I suspect it was designed for weeding, but what I prefer it for is as a planting hoe because of that curve. When I draw it with the curve down, I can pull all the dry soil on the surface off and get down to the nice moist soil underneath. Then I take the pointed corner and make a small furrow right in that nice moist soil. Now this is important for crops that take a long time to germinate. Let's say these carrots. I want to put these carrots in at just the right spacing, again, carefully, like the radishes, but I want to make sure that even though they take a long time to come up, they're never going to dry out. And that's why I made that little curve first, because I'll push the soil over the seeds, tap it in, and then every day, at least once, I'll come along with a watering can and just put a little moisture in here. Because I made that curve first, it stays there, the carrot seeds are moist, and I get absolutely perfect germination. Once they come up, then they're on their own and they get the regular irrigation that the rest of the garden gets. Now, another important planting tool is right on the end of my arm, my finger. Basically, if I'm putting in large seeds, like corn, I can just poke a hole in the ground, put them right in, or even set the seed on top of the ground and poke it in there, about an inch. In fact, the proper planting depth for most seeds is about 3 to 4 times the size of the seed. So something small like a radish or a carrot that's, 1/8, 1/16 of an inch, you're only going to put it down 1/4 of an inch. Something like corn, which is really 1/4 of an inch, 4 times that, an inch, 3/4 maybe in soil where it'd have a hard time coming up. That's all you need to do. Now with corn, you don't want to put a single row right down the center, spaced apart like that, because you might not get good pollination. So what I do with corn, since I do want to fit only a single row in this 30-inch bed, is I plant in hills. I'll put 4 or 5 seeds in a little hill about 18 inches to 2 feet away from the next little hill. Just put them in there, pat it on top, come over here and put another one in. And then when they come up, thin it to 3. That means there's 3 stalks at each place and they can cross-pollinate each other. Works very well, makes it easy to cultivate in between and keep the weeds down. Now, one last thought about seeds. Along with these pea seeds, I'm going to put something else into the soil, an inoculant. Now, peas are a legume. Peas are able to take nitrogen out of the air and put it to their use. They do that in conjunction with a bacteria. And just to make sure that bacteria is in your soil, it's a good idea to buy some. It's sold, usually where you buy your seeds, in little packets like this, mixed with some peat moss. And the best idea is to sprinkle it with your seeds before you put them in the soil. Or even after you put them in the furrow, just come along with this packet and sprinkle a little of this on top before I put the soil over the top. The bacteria in this packet says specifically that it's for peas, are mixed in here with some peat moss to keep them alive until I mix them into the soil. Then the peas have access to all that free air nitrogen, and what the heck? Gardening naturally means making use of all the things that nature has to offer. Now, a lot of the seeds I sow, I don't sow in the garden, I sow in the house or in the cold frame. And then I bring out little transplants. And there's some good techniques for that too. Come on along and I'll show you.
I like to give my flower gardens a bit of a wildflower look. Now, this is some plain old white yarrow that I picked in the field behind the house. I don't often see this for sale. If I did, I'd probably buy it because I like the simplicity of the original species. If it comes up by itself in the garden, I'll always leave it there. But I must say there's some perfectly nice hybrid yarrows that I can find in nurseries. Sometimes I don't like what hybridizers do to wild plants, but they haven't ruined the yarrows yet. In fact, they're coming out with some nice ones all the time now. This one in back here, it's an old standby. It's called Coronation Gold, and you can see why. There's a real strong gold color to its flowers. Some little baby katydid or grasshopper is sunning himself on the petals. I always like to see wildlife that feel at home in the garden like that. Here's another one. This is a slightly different yellow. It's called Moonshine, and it's got a pale sulfur yellow color that mingles well with lots of different other colors in the garden. It's looking very pretty right now next to those tall blue veronicas. It also has a nice gray, pale, fern-like foliage that's attractive even when the flower isn't in bloom. And there's some other yarrows in another part of my garden. Now, you may already be familiar with some of those yellow yarrows, and you may have seen some of the red ones like Fire King or Paprika. Those are great. I'm particularly excited by all these new pastel shades that are coming out. This one is called Salmon Beauty, and it's part of the Galaxy series that was developed recently in Germany. Here's another one. This is Apricot, and this is just starting to bloom in a lovely, soft ochre orange shade. Very subtle. And here's a softer red than some of them you'll find, Weser River Sandstone. One thing I really like to do is to combine some of these pastels in a grouping. And it makes a lovely, subtle, lacy effect in the garden.